Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session. I'm absolutely thrilled to be chairing this panel session. It's number 5 under Strand 2 on what has been an amazingly energizing first day of the 2021 Working Class Academics Conference. And we do have a lineup of 4 fantastic papers by colleagues based in the UK and Canada. We will proceed with each presentation in the order listed on the program. So it's Megan, Amy, Michelle, and Lynn. And once all speakers have presented, we will take questions. Oh, I think Megan is spotlighted. So without further ado, let me introduce Megan Burns. Megan is a PhD researcher at Oxford Brookes University. Her current project collects and examines poetry from Glasgow's Red Clydeside period. Outside of this, her research interests include Glasgow's literary tradition and contemporary working class literature. Welcome, Megan.
Hi, thank you for having me. I've got a poem to show you, so I'll just share my screen. There we go. Do you see that okay? Perfect. All right then. So I'm feeling excited for this paper, because the panel that I just watched ended by talking about poetry as a working class tradition, which is really set me up for this paper. So that's great. So today I'm going to speak about the tension between meaning and purpose in the political poetry of my PhD project, and my ongoing approach to reconciling that tension. My thesis is a project of recovery and one of textual analysis. I'm collecting and examining working class poetry, so poetry written by workers from Glasgow's Red Clydeside period. The term Red Clydeside refers to a period of really concentrated socialist, industrial and collective action in Glasgow from around 1910 to 1930. Clydeside specifically is a reference to the River Clyde, which runs straight through Glasgow and was crucial to shipbuilding and trade. Work in the area was really heavily industrial. Most workers were employed in shipyards or in munitions work. There were a number of large-scale workplace strikes, rent strikes, there were militant women's liberation movements in full swing. Numerous left-wing Sunday schools were teaching socialist and communist ideology to the children of workers. Ultimately, what we might call really radical left-wing political ideas were in circulation in the city at this time. And crucially, there was a tremendous amount of poetry produced in Glasgow during this period. I'm currently looking at poems from contemporary newspapers, political pamphlets, songbooks, and some individual collections by prominent Clydeside figures themselves. All of these poems are complicated, however, due to their very status as literary objects produced in the midst of a political struggle. While they're literary texts and they need to be treated as such, many of them have been published and circulated with a particular political purpose or aim in mind. Some of these purposes are specific, such as discouraging strike breaking, as we'll see, or urging conscientious objection. Other aims are more general, but still supportive of the movement's broader goals, such as the conversion to socialism via dissemination of anti-capitalist rhetoric. I'm going to use the anonymous poem on your screen now, What the Scabs Won't Do, which was published in 1921 to illustrate the tension between meaning and purpose. And I'll take a moment to read it now. It comes from an edition of The Worker, which was a contemporary socialist newspaper published in Glasgow. So, what the scabs won't do. No scab would write back home and say, "Dear mother, I am scabbing. I'm working here in a vile ball pen at the only job worth grabbing. I work, eat, sleep here on the job and penned in like a crook, and have on guards protecting me from the men whose job I took." Nor would he write to Molly Dunn and say, "My Molly dear, I want to prove myself a man, and that is why I'm here. I'm praying for the day to come when you and I shall wed. I know, dear, you agree with me, 'tis best to scab for bread." Nor would he take his little kids and place them on his knee, and tell with pride of the time he scabbed on men who would be free. But the man who fights for his union cause may tell with keenest pride his dear old mother way back home, or the girl he would make his bride. Exactly what his pursuit is, he has no cause for shame. And the kiddies too are glad to hear of the days when dad was game. So as I said, this was published in a socialist newspaper aimed at workers at a time when mass strikes were taking place. And it's fairly clear then that the publication of this text was undoubtedly to encourage and to secure the success of that collective action. However, the dominant school of thought in English literature, which is my field, and certainly the view that I ascribe to, is that there is no pre-existing or fixed meaning inserted into a text by its author. And even where there is, we can ignore it because the author is not the authority. It's also not the case that a text simply contains multiple meanings, but rather, as Roland Barthes puts it, the text accomplishes the very plural of meaning, an irreducible plural. So there is no single meaning concealed waiting to be located by a reader. Rather, meaning gets created in the space between reader and text. And this then begs the obvious question: how do we reconcile the absence of any fixed meaning with a poem such as this, which undoubtedly does possess a clear and deliberate political purpose? T.V. Reid provides a useful answer in his work on the literature of American protest movements. He has a great book called The Art of Protest. And Reid says, any aesthetic text can be put to political ends, and all aesthetic texts have political implications. But no aesthetic text is reducible to its political meanings. So the political purpose of a text is therefore just one aspect of a rich discussion of its significance. Any deliberate aim intended by its creation and circulation does not negate its broader aesthetic properties or its potential to create a multiplicity of meanings when encountered by different readers. Reid's comment echoes Hannah Arendt's work on the relationship between culture and politics, in which she offers the construction of cathedrals as a very helpful example of this irreducibility. She writes that while they as buildings certainly serve the needs of the community, their elaborate beauty can never be explained by these needs, which could have been served quite as well by any nondescript building. And the same can be said, I think, of the poetry of Red Clydeside, including What the Scabs Won't Do. If conversion to socialism was the sole purpose of these poems, a simple prose pamphlet detailing the evils of capitalism and the positive alternatives of socialism would have sufficed. Many such pamphlets were indeed published and circulated at the time by various socialist organizations and political parties. Yet it was poetry that prevailed. These working class socialists had real faith that poetry was a special tool in driving change. It wasn't simply the communication of a political message which guided these works. Rather, writers and readers of these poems were engaging in the production and the consumption of art. Reid outlines 10 primary functions of cultural forms within movements, the final of which is appropriate here. Whilst movement literature certainly does aim to encourage and to inform, of equal importance is its intention to, and I quote, make room for pleasure. So not only did these poems act as vessels for political agendas, but the writing and reading of them provided workers with moments of creativity, comfort, and amusement. Focusing too heavily on the more practical aims of movement literature, so building solidarity, encouraging action, those most closely aligned with our ideas of real-world activism, whilst eschewing the value of its aesthetic worth, speaks to an observable tradition of belittlement experienced by working class writers. I think the tendency to view What the Scabs Won't Do and other similar Clydeside poetry as political propaganda rather than art is likely influenced by the fact that these poems stem from and hold importance for working class communities, communities which have traditionally been deemed incapable of producing high art. And that high-low distinction is another thing we just talked about in our panel before. Working class texts are far too often reduced to the status of just historical documents or sources, useful only for retrieving objective answers about significant events, daily life, and other facets of the period in question. Ian Watson expresses a similar view in his work on political song, writing that this sort of dismissal occurs due to the work's often oral character, conscious class censorship, genuine ignorance on the part of dominant culture historians, and the opinion that different standards and practices are second-rate. Mining literary texts for historical evidence, of course, is doubly problematic. Not only are literary works irreducible in meaning, as we've seen, but history itself is equally malleable. As Jeannie Howard writes, history is not a realm of retrievable fact. but a construct made up of textualized traces assembled in various configurations by the historian or interpreter. Despite this, however, the poetry of Red Clydeside can provide an invaluable perspective on the events of the period from those at its centre. As Orlando Feeks argues with regards to the Russian Revolution, works ordered by participants of struggle are often able to provide us with a much more convincing picture of conflict due to their proximity to the source. And perhaps more importantly, not only is that picture more convincing, but it's also potentially subversive. Clydesider's poetry contains within it the potential to disrupt dominant narratives or historical accounts of the period. Historians working on Clydeside have typically adhered to one of two viewpoints: either that Clydeside is a period of bold but essentially fruitless radicalism, or as a potentially revolutionary movement in British history, which is undermined only by the failure of its leaders to organise effectively. Clydeside poetry therefore offers us an additional point of entry into this debate, allowing Clydesiders themselves to historicise events with their own voices. To borrow James C. Scott's term, these poems constitute hidden transcripts, operating outside of dominant discourse and offering readers in the present an invaluable and nuanced way into what he describes as rare moments of political electricity. So while working through the tension between meaning and purpose, I frequently return to cultural materialism. Gustav Claus makes an illuminating point on the high-low dichotomy mentioned earlier, or as he puts it, aesthetic versus non-aesthetic. And he says, even if we grant for a moment the specificity of art, how to demarcate the aesthetic from the non-aesthetic seems to me to have become increasingly intractable. It does not alter the basic problem, which is to see the object of study as the result of an activity inseparable from the wider relations between creations and their audiences. And this is the same conclusion that I'm currently working with in my thesis. Essentially, it's not the case that poetry and politics exist as two distinct connected concepts. Rather, they're inseparable and mutually engaged. So everything in the production of Clydeside poetry raises social and political issues, from working class literacy rates to the small window of time left in the working day for creative activity, to the funding of workers' small presses, and even the recovery of poems and our engagement with them here in the present day, specifically at this working class academics conference, is politically charged, raising implicit questions about literary authority and the exclusivity of the British canon. I do think, however, that the relationship between the political and the aesthetic in the poetry of Red Clydeside is even more explicit than Claus has outlined. As Katie Shaw writes in her work on the UK miners' strike, strikers' writings did not simply reflect changes brought about by conflict, but inspired the actions that authored change. And this is equally true for the poetry of Red Clydeside. Workers' poetry helped to build solidarity, reaffirm values, and keep the momentum of the cause. As we've seen in What the Scabs Won't Do, the pro-strike poetry of the workers supported and in fact urged the large-scale collective action which made notable Clydeside events such as the strike at Singers and the 40-hour strike possible. And there are other examples of this too. The poetry and songs of the socialist Sunday schools aimed explicitly to contribute to the building of a new generation of socialists. And the feminist songs of working class women motivated events such as the tremendous rent strikes of 1915. Poetry and politics are therefore mutually dependent in the Red Clydeside period. Not only are the poems political by virtue of the inescapable social forces exerted upon their production and reception, but they directly fed into and affected the political change of the period. So to close, while this is all very interesting, I do have to return to my original question, which is how does this help us reconcile the absence of fixed meaning with deliberate political purpose in political poetry? And spoiler, I have not found a clear solution, and I don't think there is a neat answer at all to this tension. Instead, I'm guided by the principles of cultural materialism, and in particular, Raymond Williams' concept of the structure of feeling. He introduces the concept as an unwieldy, and I quote, kind of feeling and thinking which is indeed social and material, but in an embryonic phase before it can become fully articulate and defined. It's very usefully vague. It's located in the spaces outside official discourse, and crucially, literature is one of those spaces. As Williams himself writes, again, I quote, The arts of a period are of major importance, for here, if anywhere, the structure of feeling is likely to be expressed. So rather than attempting to mine literary texts for objective evidence of the period in question, Williams's concept of the structure of feeling permits me a way into their historical significance and relevance without eschewing their literariness. The spirit and the conflict, the spirit and feeling of the conflict on the Clyde is captured in the textuality of these poems, their forms, their language, their deferral to other texts, but their irreducibility ensures that this spirit can never be pinned down merely as objective or measurable historical evidence. And there's some sources for you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Megan. Thank you. Yes, I think I have spotlighted Amy, who is a self-titled sort of historian. A very warm welcome, Amy, and the virtual floor is all yours.
Thanks, Anastasia, and thanks, Megan. That was really interesting, and I'm coming from a kind of historical perspective with my work, and I'm going to take on board a lot of what you said there, because a lot of that was new to me. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the Peckham Publishing Project, which is something that I've been researching as part of my master's dissertation, and then that finished a while ago, so I've kind of kept up that kind of research. And this might be new to you, and if it's not, then hopefully I take an interesting angle. So I'm just going to talk for the next 15-20 minutes a bit about these things, about what's the material that the book place in Peckham produced, how that made me feel finding that material as a working class woman, how they went about making these materials, and then what I've been doing about that today, research and acting on that, using that, being inspired by that kind of tradition to work in these kind of ways today. So where I found out about this material, I used to work at the Institute of Historical Research, and there is a lady, Layla, who may be on this call, who's a historian at the library, who was in the same union as me and was a really lovely working class colleague, and we got on, and she said, oh my gosh, you need to come and see this collection in the library. It's political pamphlets collected by Ron Heisler. And you can see some examples here. And this is where my kind of journey into finding these materials started, through a friendship with Layla and through being in that kind of place, and us having a shared passion for this kind of radical history. And I live in Peckham, and then I kind of went to South London Gallery, which I suppose is the local kind of arts cultural institution, and noticed then there was this exhibition, and the exhibition was about the book place that doesn't exist anymore, and this amazing bookshop that existed up until the 1990s, from the late 70s till the early 90s, and produced this community writing and publishing. And I just fell in love with it, especially one I particularly remember, which was an adult education project where two Peckham dinner ladies had learnt to read and write at the book place, and then wrote a book as an aid for other adults to learn how to read better, and to have material that was appropriate for their age, rather than using children's books to be able to learn to read. And this was a wonderful book that was about the children that they looked after and fed every day, and I just fell in love with this material. And I think as a working class person, I live in Peckham, I've lived in Peckham for 10 years, and places are really important to me. The place I grew up in, Scunthorpe, the place I live now in Peckham, I'm very attached to places. So it made sense for me to do some research about the kind of place that I lived. So all of this work, so some of the work that I found in the Heisler collection and some of the Peckham Publishing Project, all comes from this wider organisation, the Federation of Worker Writers and Community Publishers. And their collection today is in the Trade Union Congress Library, and some of it is digitised online. And I know there's a big digitisation project going to make more of it publicly available. And you can see some of the works here, and it's a wonderfully like diverse range of experiences and writing, and I think that's what really drew me to it, the diversity of what working class meant. And the quote here, which was in their kind of manifesto, was this explicit understanding that we're a collective identity, but we are a working class identity without guarantees. And because they had this flexible, constantly changing and evolving definition of what working class meant that was constantly being negotiated at their AGMs every year, it meant that you had this great diversity in there that you can see. You've got women's experiences, you have gay experiences, you have lots of migration narratives and things like that. So it's really great, and it's all coming together under this working class kind of identity. Here's some more examples of the kind of texts that they offered. Now, I focus on the Peckham one, but these groups that subscribed and worked with the Federation were across the UK and actually went international in the end. But these were some of the texts I was finding. Things like a mum's writing group in Bristol, you know, just amazed me. And the kind of origin story of the Federation is Chris Searle, who some of you might know, who taught at a school in East London. And Chris Searle now is kind of known as being an educationalist, kind of inspired by Paulo Freire, and he worked at this school, which is what you can see in this picture, and he published the works of some of the children and created an anthology called Stepney Words. And the head teacher did not like this and fired Chris Searle, and there's 800 school kids went on strike, and this is the picture. I won't read the sign because it makes me cry every time, but this is the sign that the school kids wrote when they went on strike, and it made the news, and there was the headlines, and this poetry anthology, you know, there was huge demand for it. It sold in the thousands, and this is one of the poems here on the left hand side that was written by a school child as part of that anthology. The other kind of competing origin story is that the Federation came around because all of these groups, like Basement Writers, in Tower Hamlets I think they were, or it could have been Hackney, and the Scotland Road Writers in Liverpool, all started kind of working in this way at the same time. Now, I work in Hackney today on a project it's around the kind of radical history of Newington Green and Stoke Newington. And I found out about this through the Federation and things like this, and this is kind of the kind of how the Peckham Publishing Project gets inspired, because if you know Hackney, for example, and if you've been there until maybe 2012, you might have come across Centreprise, which was a bit of a Hackney institution, and Centreprise was a book place, a community publishing and writing, free adult education, supplementary education, a real kind of community focused place. Centreprise supported publications like Vivian Usherwood's poetry, who again was a local school child, who wrote about his experiences of growing up in the care system and struggling at school. This edition sold 10,000 copies, you know, locally. There was a huge demand for this. And this was started by Glenn Thompson, who had come from the States and opened up Centreprise. This poem on the right-hand side was one of the later poems that Glenn published, and I think really kind of sums up Glenn's mission at Centreprise, why it's important to do this kind of work. And the quote on the bottom, unfortunately, is some criticism that was given to Glenn, you know, as an intellectual, wonderful, passionate person, you know, don't cast your pearls among swine in Hackney. And Glenn really understood the importance of publishing, and this kind of then inspired the work later in the Peckham Publishing Project, which was kind of seen as a kind of sister site to Centreprise. And what amazed me was the knowledge of why it's important to publish this material. We all grow up knowing, thinking, understanding that people who write in books and get published are worth listening to, are important, are intelligent. So to see people that were like me reflected in these books was really important to me. And to see people that aren't often reflected in books was really important. And the power of seeing those things published in a tangible format in the same way as Megan was saying, also being able to give a voice to history in the past and to be able to kind of localise some of that history too, because a lot of the projects for the Federation were extremely local. And they knew that they stood in a literary tradition, like the Thomas Cooper quote here, "Go ye and write likewise, all join hands and heads to create a library of your own," was something that they knew they were part of a literary tradition that went back hundreds of years. And these were the kind of reasons, again, just to kind of solidify that I was kind of interested in this kind of work, because I had a teacher background. Last time I studied history I was 13, but I was interested in these kind of things, and as I read more about the texts and how the processes work, which I'll go into a bit in a minute, I realised it was one of these kind of natural things. All my interests and I did my drama degree and focused on foray, and you know, all of these kind of things. Coming from a working class background, I didn't have a very good childhood, and so I have a very heightened sense of like injustice. I've been forced into kind of unfair situations, and so I realised all these things were kind of coming together, and all my interests and passions were kind of met in this work. So Peckham Publishing Project. So this is what it looks like, or looked like, the book place. It's not there anymore, on the left-hand side, on Peckham High Street. It's now an African fabric shop. I'll show you the picture a bit later on. And these are some of the texts that were published. And I'm just going to play a quick recording, hopefully this works, of one of the early employees of Peckham Publishing Project, Dave Pearson, who I interviewed recently, who's going to just share a few words about one of the first publications, which is Looking Back, and then the second video here is a bit about some context towards adult literacy and their importance of their ways of working at the time. I might have to share sound. Hopefully this works.
And you said they were piercing the book this one sentence.
Yeah, I read that.
Very
like a solicitor sign. Yeah.
So suddenly when there was someone applying for the job that you sent price, I'd taken some of their books with me. And I said, if I've got this job, the first thing I'd do was put some more photograph, get people's memories going, stop look at history.
Yeah.
And of course, they were so impressed to give them the job.
And is that where the first, that purpose, the Looking Back one, was that a collective?
No, I did it.
It was your own research?
No, I did it with the local, I remember now. I did it with Mary Bullist from the local archive.
Okay.
And I got help from the archive of the JLC in the basement.
Yeah.
But we didn't have any money. So I got Southwark to pay for it. It was clever. I said to Southwark, we're going to do this thing.
Yeah.
Can you lend us the money? We'll pay it back as soon as 10 books. And they went, well, actually, we were going to do that book.
Yeah.
I thought you were.
Yeah.
I thought of it.
Yeah.
So they lent the money to me.
Yeah.
We published the book.
Yeah.
The first print from Southwark.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah, it was 5,000.
Was that quite early on in the Peckham Publishing Project then?
The first book.
That was the first one, was it? Oh, I didn't know that.
So then we paid them the money back.
Yeah.
But I think, if I remember this correctly, they meant we were selling it in the book place and all the libraries.
Oh, right.
So that was, and the idea was to generate interest in local history, because it was a slog getting the photos in, and after, I got loads more photos.
Yeah.
But I couldn't wait to get more photographs when you had nothing to see why.
Yeah.
So a lot of those were actually in the archive, not many from private individuals, but we had already set up a writers group. Yeah. I've run a writers group, and mostly poets, or some of them were good, some were awful. Because at the time, there was popular poets like Anne Ayres. Do you know her?
Yeah, Anne Ayres, yeah.
So, yeah.
Are you a fan or not a fan?
I think she's great.
Yeah, I love her.
and obviously, that's where eventually, so I got a job there, and it probably would be great if you talk with some of those other people again.
So it was just an informal conversation with Dave and I, because I felt it was inappropriate to go into a kind of strict oral history kind of format when meeting him for the first time, because, you know, I think it's really important to kind of build those relationships, and you tend to do that. You tend to respond to another working class person in a different way, and so me and Dave ended up just having a bit of a chat and a laugh. And then Dave, the next couple of minutes is Dave talking a little bit about the context of kind of adult literacy and the importance of the kind of work that they were doing to support the local community needs.
Exactly, my job was funded by the Art Country of Britain. Our literacy and numeracy fund paid a lot. I don't know if anything came from here.
And that's because they identified a need for like adults that needed extra literacy and numeracy, right?
There was a national campaign. They brought adverts on the telly.
Oh really? I didn't know that.
You want to check the adverts on the telly involved a couple of lorry drivers,
Right.
van drivers. One of them was the actor Bob Hoskins.
Oh right.
Yeah, covering up for the fact that he couldn't read and write.
Yeah.
You know, so it was filling this form and he said, "Oh, I haven't got any glasses. Can you know, all those excuses." And what we found is a lot of people that couldn't read and write, we covered it up till their children went to school.
Right.
Then
they couldn't help them with
then approach a literacy project.
Yeah.
And we were running that a literacy and numeracy project. And I wasn't a qualified teacher, but I did. Or some people taught ESL.
That's what I did for a while.
And I did help with literacy, and I did help with numeracy, but because of the experience of working with Cambridge House Literacy Project, there's nothing better than actually publishing work.
Exactly.
So that's what we wanted to do. But there was little books you saw they were in red, I think. That was a pack of 6, as I remember, that Tanya really put together. I must have set it up to be printed because I was at this art college background. And then we did a collection of, then the writers group had a collection of poetry. I found a couple of them here. And then we did one of West Indian stories from Milk River.
Yes, I read that.
Oh, you seen that?
Yeah.
I love those pictures of them.
So that's just a little bit from Dave about how they worked in those early days. And I imagine for those of you who do similar work, thinking that, you know, you can get money from the GLC or you could go to your local council and borrow some money seems very alien, as it did to me. It was great to be able to meet Dave and hear a bit about that. So that's a bit about the process of how they worked, and I'm just going to spend the last couple of minutes talking about the content, because I think what I liked about them is they were radical in a few different ways. They were radical in the processes, the way that they made the material as a community, and collectively writing, and through this format of free education to try and navigate this difficult system in a working class community, but then also the material that they wrote was reflecting their lives. Now, some of the material isn't inherently political. It's not really about being working class, but because of the format that it is in, you're hearing from with these working class voices, and a lot of the time it is about issues like housing, it's about living in that local area, it's about their experiences. There's quite a few materials like this, which is kind of memoir based, and it's interesting reading these materials because these experiences of childhood experiences are of World War I, because this is people that have kind of grown up, they're writing this material in the late 70s, early 80s as older people. So their experiences are kind of growing up in the 1920s in places like Walworth and Bermondsey and things like that. This one's a lovely book written by a local guy, and he explains about Thursday being a mixed up sort of day because they pawn everything on a Friday, and so at that point you've used up all your resources, everything's been pawned, but you know Friday's round the corner, and so there's a kind of negative and a positive looking forward to kind of mixed up feeling, which I thought was a really beautiful metaphor for poverty. Another kind of one of these working class memoirs that make up quite a bit of the collection, again is based in Bermondsey, just down the road, and it has a really wonderful but wonderfully sad story it's actually really interesting, this text, because the author isn't talking about himself, and he's talking about a kind of fictional street, and so he talks about different characters on this fictional street, which is obviously taken from his real experiences and or stories that he knows from someone else, about grottos. Grottos were a working class tradition where, you know, children would make a little kind of display on their front gardens, for example, out of stones and feathers and knickknacks around the house, and one of the children finds a picture of a soldier, doesn't realise at the time that it's their dad that has passed away in the war, and puts the picture in the grotto, and someone then recognises the child's dad, and usually what you would do if you like that grotto, people as they pass by on their way to work would maybe throw a penny in or something, and then the children could get a bit of pocket money. And someone then mentions that they knew her dad, and I think for the first time she realises that she did have a father and he died in the war. And then the last line is heartbreaking. It says she did something that no child should do during grotto season. She cried. So there's these really kind of emotional experiences of growing up at the time. Peckham Publishing Project put an awful lot of focus on representation in their works. So images of people of colour in positions like GPs as dentists, showing the diversity of their area, was really important to Peckham. And because of that, migration narratives make up a big part of the work too. At the time of writing, there was a big West Indian community in Peckham, but nowadays it's more of an African community, and you see a lot of people's kind of expectations of London falling short once they've moved here. There's a lovely piece called First Steps by Muriel, who's the author, who explains that she doesn't know what to do and to navigate the snow. She's never experienced snow before, and her husband, who has lived in London a while and she's joined him later on, explains that she must step in where people already step and make a way, which is a really poetic, a bit like Megan was saying. I mean, these are texts that are, you know, that telling people that this feeling of assimilation that they're forced to feel, but is really poetic and beautifully written. So This Is England is another wonderful compilation, and this is migration narratives, whether that's Ireland, Vietnam, from the Caribbean, and there's some stories too. Hyacinth writes a very kind of biographical narrative of her unfortunate problems with housing in this country, which leads to the death of her child while she is in hospital giving birth to another child, because the housing that she is put in is so unsuitable for her needs. So a lot of it is quite hard hitting, and there is a wonderful compilation of women's writing in Peckham, that starts off with this poem which is addressed directly to the Prime Minister of the time, directly about funding cuts to adult education. And, you know, I'll let you read that briefly, but, you know, it's talking about issues that are very relevant today, about defunding kind of education, about issues with childcare and things like that. There's also amazing accounts of kind of diarised historical accounts of women's days, which as a historian is amazing to have this kind of record of what these women were doing in their own words at that time. They weren't just about writing, they were a community centre. You will see posters of them doing kind of community events with steel drum bands and face painting and getting out and putting on these kind of events in the local estates and things like that, as well as offering free reading and writing, as well as offering kind of community publishing opportunities. This is a lovely calendar that Dave gave me, which I'm very grateful for. And so where does that kind of leave us today? So I live in Peckham, and this is Peter, who runs Books Peckham, and Peter had a stall recently just off Peckham Rye, and since the 90s, really, late 90s, has been the only bookshop. So the book place opened because there was no bookshop in Peckham, similarly kind of inspired by Centerprise in Hackney, and they realised they needed one, and then Centerprise closed, and since then there hasn't been a bookshop in Peckham. There is in East Dulwich, but that's a bit more affluent. Peter has since then had to move to East Dulwich because Peckham's going under a lot of redevelopment and things like that. But Peter is very aware of this kind of literary tradition and is looking to work in similar kind of community publishing projects. This is my favourite piece of graffiti, which is locally and on the street near where Peter is now. So I will just finish up with these kind of reasons and kind of thoughts on some of the kind of main themes when I was reading through the work of the Peckham Publishing Project, which could be about today or could have been about when Peckham was writing, when the Peckham Publishing Project was kind of writing most of their texts, which is between kind of 79 and 82 or something like that. And I think that I will leave you there. This is a picture on the right hand side of what the Peckham Book Place is like today.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was really fantastic. Thank you. Really interesting. Spotlighting Michelle. Thank you very much to the two previous speakers. Really fantastic, Megan, amazing, Amy. We're now moving to our third speaker, and I would like to welcome Michelle Jamieson. Michelle Jamieson is a final year PhD researcher at the University of Glasgow and research fellow at Edinburgh Napier. Michelle's work includes using quantitative data ethically and reflexively to explore complex mental health conditions and employment. They are passionate about bringing their own lived experience into academia and opening the doors for others to do the same. Outside of work, they use horror films to distress. That sounds really cool, Michelle.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Warm welcome. The virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Anastasia. I will share my screen. There we go. So can you all see a sort of poster thing? Good. Yeah, so thanks very much for having me today. I'm Michelle Jamieson. It's interesting that I'm after two people who've spoken about poetry, one about Glaswegian poetry. It's not so much part of my proper academic work, but I do publish a lot of working class focused poetry in my spare time, and I've done writing residencies for mental health charities in Scotland. So it's interesting that this is the session that I'm in. And I should start my timer because I waffle a little bit. Today I'm going to be speaking about more of my lived experience and how that has impacted on my academic work. So my background is in psychology, and I'm currently, as Anastasia said, finishing off my PhD. And now a research fellow in basically mental health statistics, and I do not know how I got here as a working class person who also has really bad dyscalculia, by the way, which is like dyslexia for numbers, and somehow I've managed to make my academic career in numbers. So one of the things I speak about quite often, especially in the past year, as others have spoke about today, and at other conferences, bring a bit more vulnerability into my work. I research conditions like psychosis, but also live with psychosis as a condition. Sometimes termed schizophrenia, psychosis, it can be part of other conditions like bipolar disorder. It can be part of a lot of different conditions. What I think of the label and what others may think of the label is probably a whole, like a circumference in itself, not the next 15 minutes. So today, the post that you can see, and I'll post the link after I finish speaking, all the materials for today are actually freely available in a repository online. And yeah, I'll just jump right into it. So I've titled it an autoethnographic account of studying what I live with, which is psychosis. But that's just a fancy way of saying that I was told to keep a diary when I first became unwell, and continued to do it through my PhD. And because my PhD does look at people living with psychosis, and it's a very traditional quantitative PhD, i.e. numbers based, I thought it would be very nice if I could get some lived experience, especially poetry writing in there. It's an ongoing thing in supervision, so we'll see how that goes. So an autoethnographic account of studying what you live with. As you can probably hear, I am very Glaswegian, very working class, and I'm so glad that I found a space like this today, because as you can probably see, even in writing down my diary excerpts, I tidied them up. I write a lot in Scots. I actually speak a little bit badly Scottish Gaelic, and I sometimes write in that too. But for the purposes of this poster that I made a wee while ago, I even tidied up the writing to present, and I'm not even looking at the subtitles to see what they're making of my accent either. So even just so what I'm trying to say is this is very much a bit of a crossroads in my academic and personal life of who am I as a working class person studying with the condition that I live with, because I am coming to the end of my PhD, and what I've heard a lot of people speaking about today is being working class is a massive part of my identity, but when I get that PhD I'll be Dr. Jamieson, and does that make me middle class? Does that mean I'm not working class anymore? I don't know if anyone else identifies with this. My family think as soon as I'm doctor, I will be middle class, and that's a great thing because that means I'm then secure and everything else. I don't want to burst their bubble about academia and what it means what security is in academia. So to my family, I will be middle class and secure. To me, I don't really know what that means to me, because working classness is such a big part of me and my work, previous work. I've done a lot of work around austerity in Glasgow and Scotland, and my working classness has led to me being invited into spaces and sharing experiences with participants, especially one-to-one interviews, and it's a slightly terrifying feeling thinking that as soon as I'm doctor I will be middle class and seen as other, because as a lot of you probably identify with, where I'm sitting at just now, I feel like other anyway. I'm not working class enough for my family and friends anymore because that university has made me uppity, and not quite middle class for Russell Group institutions. And yeah, it's strange, and that's what kind of led to this autoethnography, going through my diaries, going through my sketches, trying to make sense of it in a way that works for me, because I don't want to lose that massive part of my identity that I speak about so much with other people, that I think about every day, and the memories that I think, the writing that I write. And just as an aside, I did quite recently see, and someone please, if you know the authors, put it in the chat for me, there was a study released around, they've done a survey of academics, and the majority of middle class academics apparently identify as working class, or when they self-define, and I know definitions are a very big grey area, but traditional middle class people will self-define as working class. And I don't know how others felt about this study, but when I read that, I was quite angry, because to me as a working class person from Glasgow, I grew up in very deprived areas, still live in deprived areas, have a lot of trauma that comes from being working class. Not everyone does, but trauma like food insecurity, being in and out the care system, dealing with ongoing trauma that led to psychosis, everything. And it just really peed me off that they almost claimed they were working class, but didn't have, I don't know how to describe it, didn't have the experiences to go along with it. Truth be told, when I read it, I was like, well, if you want to be working class, take some of my trauma then, have it, because I, like, you have it, because I don't want to deal with it. And that also led to sort of bringing this autoethnography together as well. So I suppose I should go into a little bit about the psychosis experience. It's strange to talk about it because it is part of my everyday life, and I do link it to my working classness, as a lot of the things that led up to it were from childhood, but it's just such a background thing, which I suppose is good. Is it's not a terribly distressing thing anymore, but it definitely has impacted on the PhD experience and how I have tried, as we all have, tried to navigate the academic structure from a working class first gen background, which means you don't know the unwritten rules of the physical and like metaphorical place. I should have had coffee before I spoke tonight. And the psychosis, as you can imagine, just really compounded these factors. From the psychosis just sort of interweaving the university grounds, and especially my poor supervisor, into the unusual beliefs that I had in first year, which then meant supervision was very, very hard, and that I found it very hard to be in the same room as them, to try and to do a literature review and make sense of statistics that are very glaring. I don't know if anyone here has a background in psychology or mental health, but if you are diagnosed with something like psychosis or schizophrenia, they say it immediately cuts 20 years from your lifespan. And that, for me, and that coupled along with a lot of the statistics around working class people's health and mortality rates, especially in Glasgow. I hate calling it the Glasgow effect, but that is what you most commonly hear it as, was very confronting and very emotional. For me here was me trying to make sense intellectually of these statistics while going through it myself, hearing academics talk about people with psychosis and schizophrenia in very negative ways, hearing academics and superiors talking about working class Glaswegian people. Bearing in mind we're at the University of Glasgow in the West End, which is a very posh part of the city, speaking about working class people very negatively, while on the other hand the university are trying to roll out wine and participation access things. It's very confronting being in the academic space dealing with that anyway, never mind when you've got dealing with psychosis that traditionally involves unusual beliefs and paranoia and everything that goes along with it. So it kind of just very, unfortunately, very nicely rolled into this massive ball of poor mental health, coupled with imposter syndrome, being nervous all the time. You can see here in some of my themes and the upload I have online, you can access larger slides as well. I do often think back and remember the times where, if I did have to go on campus, the supervision, just being on Glasgow University's campus, would make me physically throw up. I just couldn't deal with it's a very imposing university with obviously a massive reputation behind it, and I just couldn't really deal with being there as working class. Imposter syndrome is something everyone deals with, but I think it has that added extra layer of spice when you're working class and don't really know what's going on, and also don't really have anyone to guide you through that. It's not been until very recently I've had someone at university to guide me through just everything. I can't even really put it into words, but it's everything. You're all probably sitting there thinking, just everything to do with it. And yeah, that's why I think things like this, autoethnography, poetry, that the two speakers before me were going through, is so important in academia, and why I'm very passionate about doing these talks, although it's got nothing to do with my actual work, apparently. Yeah, so spoke a little bit about imposter syndrome. Nervousness has been through this whole little talk that I've done. The identity is a very big one. For me, as I said, being working class was also interwoven with quite traumatic experiences of food insecurity, housing insecurity, and out of care. A little side story I always tell is when I was in 5th year of secondary school in Scotland, which would have been around 16, 17, and forgive me, I can't remember what year that translates to in the English system. Loads of local Scottish unis came to the school to speak to you about going to university if you had certain grades. And we did notice in the school it pulled in from the 5 most deprived areas of Glasgow, which constantly rank as a 1 on the SIMD, if anyone's familiar with it, deprivation index. But the streets surrounding it were quite affluent. And we did notice that the kids from the surrounding streets did go to the top by University of Glasgow. Myself and my friends got taken down to the army, and it was the middle of the Afghanistan war, and about 70% of us signed up. So I never went straight on to uni from school. I was in the army for roughly a month before they found out I was really, really crap at it, and left. So even just little stories like that, and I've actually been hearing the army story quite a lot today from speakers at this conference. It's definitely a major theme for working class people in the UK, I think. Just another little aside that I think perfectly encapsulates working classness before moving on to university. It wasn't until I went to university that I realised that, this sounds very bad, that it was okay for your dad to live with you. In school, we thought the people who had their fathers in their houses were really posh, even if they weren't. And just because that was my experience at that time, everyone around me, friends, cousins, your dad was kind of there, but not there. He just kind of floated about in the background and turned up when he turned up. So when I went to university and realised exactly what a stable family life was, I was quite shocked. And I was in my 20s because I went to college for a year before moving on to university. So I think I was 20 when I started university. And to be honest, the little side stories I have about working classness in Glasgow and dealing with academia and just how I came to my own class consciousness is probably a whole other talk, and I do talks about them if anyone is interested. So yeah, that has been sort of the not a very linear talk tonight about the autoethnography that I've done, but it does kind of capture the little bits, the 3 main themes that I have identified so far. This is ongoing work, and if I don't get it into the PhD, I do plan on publishing it elsewhere, because I think it's not tooting my own horn, but I do think it is quite important. I would like to see more working class academics publishing sort of stuff like this, but also realise it's very confronting to engage with your own experiences like this in a safe way. And I'm quite lucky that I can do that and share with you tonight. So yeah, I think I'll wrap up there before I go on to another tangent, another weird working class story. And I've got about 50 seconds left. I will post in the link as soon as I'm finished stop sharing, where you can access all the materials. I do have a website. I do loads of different stuff like mentoring working class academics, run poetry writing classes actually, which is nice that I'm in this Strand tonight. Do loads of different things to try and not pull up that ladder behind me. And yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad I'm in like-minded company, and thank you for listening to this weird non-linear talk tonight. And I'll stop sharing right there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Michelle. That wasn't weird at all. It felt very intimate. It felt really generous, very close, and it really resonated a lot with personal experiences and other collective experiences from working class friends and colleagues. So thank you for sharing. That was really immensely powerful. Thank you very much.